Hello, members. Welcome and good evening. My name's Anna Spooner and I'm part of the tastings and events team at the Wine Society. And it brings me great pleasure to welcome Spencer from the Cocoa Runners. So good evening, Spencer.
Good evening, Anna. Lovely to see you and lovely to see all of your members.
It's great to see you again. For many of you, this may not be your first time. We have had Spencer on to do a wonderful or craft chocolate, I should say, and wine tasting with us before, which was such a rip-roaring success that we decided we had to repeat it again this year, but with new wines and new chocolates. So even if you have met Spencer before, we hopefully are going to offer you something new and something exciting tonight with 2 dry red wines and then 2 sweeter wines, both fortified actually. But not heavy fortified wines. So hopefully you received my email, members, suggesting that you can get your red wines poured, no problem, but that your 2 second wines should probably be chilled. If you didn't get that memo, please don't worry. There's still time to pop them in the fridge now if you'd like, and we'll let you know when to bring them out. But otherwise, honestly, it's not to worry. They don't need to be ice cold. They just have a bit of extra freshness if they've been chilled. So before we crack on, a tiny bit of housekeeping from my side. Please do feel free to use the Q&A. We're going to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. I know with events like this, I've got huge amount of questions that I like to ask our other experts. So please do feel free to ask questions about both wine and chocolate, and perhaps both combined, and use the chat. I can see already that some of you are using it and letting us know where you are from York, Canterbury, Nottingham. So hello and welcome. Make sure if you are using the chat tonight that you do select everyone and not just hosts and panelists. Otherwise it will just be myself, Spencer, and the lovely Mahesh behind the scenes who'll be able to see it. Final hello as well to those of you watching on YouTube this evening. I know that there are lots of you, so hello and welcome, and I hope that you have as much fun as we did putting this together. So without further ado, I'll let you know how the evening's going to go. I will be essentially handing over to Spencer, who's going to give us a really good briefing on how to taste chocolate, importantly, because hopefully most of you know at least a little bit about how to taste wine, but tasting chocolate is a very different phenomenon. So we'll do that first, and then we will go through the pairings after that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the lovely Spencer. So cheers, Spencer, and thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Anna. And we should get going. I don't know whether or not everybody can see the slides, but I hope so. What we're going to try and do, just to sort of start with, just so that you're all sort of aware of what is going on, is that we're going to start by telling you a little bit about how to taste chocolate. Just before we do that, one quick sort of comment and warning from our side. The only thing that we do sort of just need to warn you is that one of the chocolates, the Frizz Whole, does contain milk. So if any of you are vegan or lactose sensitive, I'm really sorry, you'll have to sort of try that with another bar. But you've got 3 great dark chocolate bars to start with. And as Anna sort of said, look, you guys are all experts. You are the Wine Society, the world's first and the world's most amazing club for wine enthusiasts, which I've been a member of since I was at university and love it. And I'm delighted to be here. But there is a different way of tasting chocolate to tasting wine. And what we'd like to do is, you've got 4 different pairings. Don't worry, we're going to show this to you a number of different times. But just to be very confusing, the first chocolate that I'd like to try and use to get you to basically learn to eat chocolate like a pro is the last one, which is the one which is from Pump Street. It's called the Pump Street Grenada. And I'm going to use Anna as my sort of, yeah, that's right, the sort of the assistant for this. So what I want you all to do is to basically open this bag of Pump Street chocolate open. And then I want you to basically sort of take it out. And basically admire how shiny it is and how nice it looks. And I've already sort of started just to make certain that it was all right. Like Anna will have prepared all the wines to make certain they're okay. And what I'd love you to do is to basically take a couple of bits of chocolate, admire them, you can break them off, and then give them a quick sniff. Yeah. So the sniff is very important, and looking at it and admiring it. But you do this obviously with wine when you swirl it around the glass and you give it a sniff. But there's something you can do with chocolate that you can't really do with wine, which is a little bit odd and a little bit strange, but I'm still going to try and get you to do it, which is I want you to take one piece of chocolate, and Anna's already ahead of me, so she already knows this. Basically, hold it up to your ear and snap it. And that snap is incredibly important to explain why chocolate is unique and will reveal to you some amazing attributes about the difference between taste and flavor. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, and I know this looks very strange, the good news is that you're not having to do this in front of the rest of the people who are here. But what I'd love you to do, and Anna's going to do this with me just to make the fun of it, I'd like you to basically take a piece of chocolate, a small piece, but at the same time, with your other hand, I'd like you to hold your nose, squeeze it tightly shut, grab the chocolate, and put the chocolate on your tongue and just suck it. Now, the difference between doing this with chocolate and wine is that if you have a glass full of wine, it's quite hard to breathe through your mouth. But with chocolate, as you can see, Anna is basically opening her mouth, smiling, laughing, and it's absolutely fine. You will not asphyxiate while you wait for the chocolate to melt. So I'm going to basically just talk for about another 5 or 10 seconds. If it hasn't started to melt for you all yet, don't worry, you're allowed to chew it a little bit. But what I want you to do is see if you can actually detect anything as that chocolate is melting in your mouth. And then I'm going to count to 3. Anna's already got ahead there.
Sorry, I beat you to it.
Count to 3.
I'm too excited.
And then I want you to basically pretend you've run 100 meters and breathe in and out through your mouth a lot. So 1, 2, 3. And what should suddenly happen is you should suddenly be accosted by a whole wave of different aromas. And this is where the genius of chocolate comes out, because the reason why that snap is so important is that chocolate is literally the only stuff that, if you think about it, melts when you put it in your mouth, but it's pretty solid at room temperatures. So what happens when you put it in your mouth is it releases all of the aromas and the volatiles. And it's quite important to sort of distinguish between 2 different things here. So if we look at the next slide, the really important thing about chocolate, so this is the pairing. So actually, I'll just do this with Zilius. So the really important thing about chocolate is that you get both taste, which you get immediately, and then flavors, which take a lot longer to develop. So what I really want you to do as you focus on the chocolate is give it a bit of time. Just as wine goes on this sort of wonderful course of balance, length, intensity, and complexity, basically let your chocolate wash over you and reveal lots of different attributes. And as we do this, I think what we're now going to do is, now that we've sort of got that first action, which is just to sit back and let it savor and go through slowly, what I'd love you all to do now is basically, I'm going to hand back over to Anna, and Anna's going to talk about the first wine, and we're going to move on to a different chocolate. But as you try that first chocolate, just think about the difference in flavors and wait for 5 to 10 seconds, because that's how long it'll take. Great.
Thank you, Spencer. Yeah, I've always loved doing that with chocolate. From now on, it's my it's my enjoyment of chocolate has increased tenfold since meeting you. So I do appreciate it. And I think also these little, I don't know, members, if you've seen these, I also find them very, oh, sorry, I've got my screen blurred, so it's not very helpful. But your little handouts that Spencer's kindly made for us as well. You've got some ideas about some flavors. I'm going to hopefully do something similar when I talk about the wine, and then Spencer will do the same with the chocolate. But just as with wine tastings, I do encourage you to let us know what flavors you're getting. Don't wait for us, type them in the chat. Let us know if you're with friends and family. Be vocal about what you're tasting, because I think probably more than any 2 items or two consumables in the world, chocolate and wine are surely the ones that you share, whether it's virtually or with those people next to you. So please do let us know what you're thinking. So and I apologize, Spencer, I know exactly which slide you were after, the wave one, and I don't know what I've done with it, so I apologize. But we are going on to our first pairing, which is the Newton Johnson Full Stop Rock from Hemel and Aarde in South Africa. And that is with the Boho, which is a 70% chocolate that obviously I will let Spencer do the honors talking about. I won't go into any more detail than that, but I'll start with the wine. And the main reason to start with the wine, quite frankly, is for my own selfish reasons, that I then like to sit back and watch Spencer and enjoy that with a glass of wine. But there really is no right or wrong way of tasting wine and chocolate together. If you want to taste a little bit of the chocolate first, then please do. You don't have to, you don't have to wait for us, like I said. So Hemel and Aarde is essentially, it used to be part of Walker Bay. And I'm telling you this because it has a huge impact on how this wine is produced. So Walker Bay is this little sort of khaki green area right down here in the tip. And they divided the Walker Bay up because they realized that it was a very prime, expensive, gorgeous region for cool climate viticulture in South Africa. Now, why is that important? Why worry about cool climate? Cool climate essentially brings a few things to wine, but one is a level of acidity, should we say. This is, after Elgin, the coolest area to produce wine. I often think the Hemel and Aarde looks a little bit like Scotland, as does Elgin. It gets a decent amount of rain. I mean, 750 millimeters might not sound like much, but in a country ridden with drought issues, it's quite a lot, but it is still gorgeously sunny. So what you end up with are wines made from a few varieties, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but they have fruit and freshness. And the fruit is still ripe, but it's not this kind of very, very warm, I'm thinking sort of a Barossa Shiraz ripe. This definitely has a bit more restraint to it. And you can really tell more than anything by two particular grapes that thrive here, which are Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Those are really cool climate grapes. And this particular producer, Newton Johnson, does make exceptional Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. They were started in the mid-90s by Felicity and Dave. So Dave was Johnson, Felicity was Newton. They got married, they started this winery, and they had a reputation for Pinot and also Chardonnay because Dave was a Cape wine master. His thesis was on Pinot Noir. So for anybody that knows the region, I'll just take that down whilst I explain. For anyone that knows the region Hemel and Aarde, it means heaven on earth. And it's this beautiful valley I just showed you. And there are two very, very famous producers sat underneath this one down the valley, Hamilton Russell and Bouchard Finlayson. And these guys kind of went just a little bit higher, even cooler, and bought the property in 2001, planted their own stock of vines, said, we are going to focus on quality, quality, quality. And they have made wine from their own fruit since 2009. And this is a particularly special site. So I should mention now that they are involved, but the two sons, Gordon and Bevan, now manage the property. And if anybody watched, we did an amazing Zoom with them. They're fabulous guys. And if you do visit, my goodness, it is possibly my favorite winery in South Africa to go and visit. So please get there. But just as we stood with Bevan and Gordon having this amazing tasting, they've got a beautiful platform, and down the winery is this block of Syrah, and they make two Syrah wines, and it's so rocky in this block that down in the bottom for the other wine they make, they have to actually stake it on single stakes as they do in Côte Rôtie. So they've got this real nod towards traditional European styles, but in this place that's clearly not European at all. And Full Stop Rock doesn't sound like a European name. It's actually named after a surf break in Cape St. Francis. They're both really big surfers, but it does allude to this very, very rocky vineyard. It's Syrah based, so I think it's 80% Syrah. You'll have to hold me to that exact number. It's around 80% Syrah, but it's not a Shiraz, and that's worth saying. It's not this compote, warm sort of Shiraz style from Australia. It's definitely, again, that European nod. So why did I pick it? Syrah has slightly softer tannins than Cabernet. We're about to have a Cabernet that's got a little bit of Franc in it as well, because I know Spencer likes Cabernet Franc. But this has slightly softer tannins than a Cabernet. Generally, Syrah is still a very big wine, but the tannin structure is different. And I think that in particular makes it quite an interesting pairing with chocolate. It's also more on that dark fruit spectrum. So whereas later on when we get to wine 3, we're really going to go into some sort of floral and red character, here it's mainly black. There is a little Mourvèdre and a little Grenache. I think it's sort of 12%, 8%. So there is a little bit of red fruit in there from the Grenache, but the vast majority is this sort of rich, almost slightly tapenade-esque, which is again quite European, but still with this amazing black fruit. And it has seen a bit of oak. And I think the nice thing about Syrah is often when Syrah is slightly oaked, it brings not a chocolate necessarily, but a cocoa. It's not so much the sweet chocolate flavor, it's that cocoa flavor. So I found this a really fun pairing. I have to be honest, the Boho was one of the chocolates that really won me over, but I found it very hard to find the perfect wine. And I went through a lot of wines to find it because I thought I really wanted to do it justice. So yes, that was why I chose it. And honestly, it's a bit of a crowd pleaser wine in our house. We often buy this wine. It's sort of a nod to South Africa and to it being a Rhone blend, but it doesn't taste like a Rhone blend per se. It's just a bit of fun. So Spencer, what do you think?
I think it's a fantastic wine. I was really intrigued by it. I was also intrigued actually as to how you were going to match, Charlie Berg's Guatamala and La Bar, because it's an intriguing chocolate. We're going to come on to it in a minute, but it is very hard to match. But I think you've really managed to sort of do it, not least because you basically, one of the attributes of this wine is it is quite fresh, as well as having a lot of body to it. It's got sort of that sort of almost sort of effervescent, iridescent sort of quality, which I think is what you want from a cool climate when you get this sort of grape. And I think it's, I'm looking forward to sort of, seeing how everybody thinks of this pairing. But I think one of the things I would encourage everybody to do as you go through this is actually do try the different chocolates with the wine, because you will basically learn how brilliantly Anna has done these pairings, because they are really, really good. So no, I absolutely think so. So we're back now to sort of chocolate tasting, and this is a chocolate made in America by a chap called Charlie Berg. And what I'd love you all to do again is basically open it up. And again, just do remember the sort of the ritual that we go through. And you can already sort of tell it's a lovely mold, but it's a different color to the other one, which is something which is quite important. It's exactly the same percentage. You should immediately get a lot of different fruits. Snap it. Again, listen for that snap. You don't have to hold your nose at this point. You do have to snap it, because that's very, very important. And then just sort of let it melt a little bit on your tongue. And what we strongly advise you do with chocolate, because you guys are all actually going to be one step further ahead than anybody else that we normally do tastings with, because you're used to articulating flavors. But what we find quite useful when we do tastings is in your packs, you should also have a sheet, which has basically got a picture of a wave in it. And the reason why we use the concept of a wave is that one of the great things about flavor, whether it's in wine or in chocolate, is that it evolves. It's not like taste. It's not like sugar, salt, and fat, which just immediately hit you. And what you really want to do is basically sit back and just wait to see what happens. So first of all, think about the texture, and then what happens with the initial flavors as they wash over you, and then what sort of complexity and length do you get to it. So for me, the reason why this wine is why this chocolate works so well with the wine that Hannah's picked, with the Newton Johnson, is that it's got both a creaminess, but also a certain sort of vibrancy to it. It's almost got a sort of sharpness, and it's got the tannins, it's got the structure to be able to sort of work with the wine, but it's also got a very distinct sort of fruit, red currant fruit, sort of some black notes there too. It doesn't quite have the tapenade, but it's got that sort of high note, which I think really pulls it through. Now, the other thing which is wonderful about this, one of the things that I should have warned you at the beginning, I'm sorry I didn't, is we're also going to try and use this tasting, give you a crash course in the history of chocolate, and also, because we've just hit Valentine's Day, to basically try and dispel a few myths about chocolate and Valentine's Day. But to give you a little bit of an idea, you are basically trying a very, very interesting chocolate here, because the chocolate that you get from here, Anna, if you want to show the next slide, I can sort of explain a little bit on the pictures. This chocolate is fascinating. So what's happening with it is it's grown by these amazing people called the Ketchi. Now, the Ketchi people, and by the way, on the far right-hand side, you've got Charlie, who is a great guy from upstate East Coast in the States. But basically, the real story, the real hero of this chocolate are the Ketchi tribe. Now, the Ketchi live in Guatemala, just above Belize, and they basically can track their history all the way back to the Maya. And the reason why this chocolate is so extraordinary is this chocolate is the first chocolate that we actually have any record of anyone consuming in Europe. So most of you will probably know that chocolate comes from South America. The first records we've got a bit of Columbus, who basically thinks it's a unit of currency because he doesn't really understand that it can also make an amazing drink. And then Cortez sees it, and we'll come on to him in a sec, because he's the guy who really kicks off this myth about chocolate and aphrodisiacs and everything, the rest of it. But the first time we've actually got a record of anybody having chocolate in Europe is in 1550-44, when in the court of what will become King Philip II of Spain, basically he is met by the Ketchi tribe, who bring, along with a bunch of rather attractive feathers, some chocolate for him to try. And this tribe, the Ketchi, are the same people who now grow this chocolate that you've got. So you are basically having an incredibly historic chocolate tonight, which I think goes brilliantly well with the wine. So there you go.
I did not know that, Spencer. So that's lovely.
No, there you go. So Ketchi, if you get our weekly emails, you will win any pub quiz on chocolate. We guarantee that. So there's a question which quickly flashed up. So the drying notes that you get. So a little bit like, there's a question about why does this one, basically, why does it dry out your mouth more? Why is it more astringent than the Pump Street? And there are, I mean, let's just sort of step back a level and talk about astringency. So astringency is what you get. It's not a taste, it's not a flavor. It's what you get with tannins in wine. It's also what you get from the tannins in chocolate. And there are two broad ways that you can control the amount of astringency that you get. One is the amount and the type of chocolate that you get. And basically, the Grenadian chocolate is inherently a little bit less tannic than this chocolate from Guatemala, the Lachua. The variety is that. But actually, the second reason is the way you make it. So milk chocolate, even though it can have less added sugar sometimes than dark chocolate, I'll come on to that in a minute, it's actually what else you add to it. And in the case of Pump Street, they do add a bit of cocoa butter to give it that more smoothness and that more mouthfeel. Now, Charlie is traditional American style. The American style craft chocolate is very much what is called 2-ingredient. So it's literally just cocoa beans and a bit of sugar. European style chocolate, and Pump Street, Chris Brennan is part of this, they believe in adding a bit of cocoa butter back into the chocolate to bring out some of the richness. And that fools your mouth into thinking that it's creamy and therefore less astringent.
Oh.
And there's some other great tricks. If any of you sort of want to, another great trick which we often play when we do our own just chocolate only tastings, and I've done this a number of times with Anna too, is that most people find actually having 100% chocolate very difficult. And yet, actually, chocolate is a lot less astringent than, say, for example, coffee. So what we do is we actually get you to chew a coffee bean and then have some 100%. And then everybody basically switches off their sense of astringency and they can delight in the flavors. And you can do that with red wine too. But anyway, that's sort of taking us too far down a rabbit hole for now. So we need to get back on.
I think though, Spencer, one interesting point is I've obviously picked up on those tannins because this felt, you've said the content's the same, it's still 70%, but that Granada for me with that extra cocoa butter, it needed a sweeter, a wine with residual sugar in for me, because I wasn't pairing exactly like you say, that sort of astringency. And that's maybe why Syrah was such a nice choice for me as well, because it does have that slightly unusual tannin. It's not quite as high, but it's definitely there.
But I think it's also the cool climate. It's the freshness that you get in both, which I think is the beautiful element of this pairing. Because there's a sort of sherbetiness and effervescence in both the wine and the chocolate, which is just a lovely pairing.
Yeah. Oh, fabulous. I love the piece of history. Thank you, Spencer.
So we're going to do another quick bit of history on the next slide, which is we're just basically going to explain how chocolate came to be associated with Valentine's Day and sex and the rest of it. So if you just quickly sort of remember your history, which is that Cortez came across chocolate. Actually, the first time he came across chocolate, he was so sort of amazed that Aztec soldiers could march on a day with just a couple of cups of chocolate. But that's what he wrote about. But the stuff that we all remember is his basic story about Montezuma before he'd go off and visit all of his wives, consuming the froth of 50 cups of chocolate poured into golden beans. Somebody just points out in the chat that cocoa butter is listed in that. This is a peculiarity of the way that Americans actually have to list chocolate. The ingredients list in chocolate is very important. You should never buy anything in a chocolate bar if you don't have those ingredients at home. So you don't want to have any E numbers, palm oils, vegetable fats, or the rest of it. But different countries have got radically different rules. So if you buy a bar of chocolate in Germany, it has to say by law cocoa liquor or cocoa mass, and then cocoa butter. Don't ask me why, it's just a strange rule. And in America, they've got equally strange rules. But back onto the history of chocolate. Basically, everybody gets confused by two different things about the history of chocolate and sex. One of which is basically these three people down below, who are basically the Marquis de Sade, Casanova, and then Charles II. So you probably all know about Casanova and the Marquis de Sade being very into chocolate. But actually, the guy who really shoots it in the sort of the stratosphere in England is actually Charles II. But really, the reason why I think chocolate is so associated with notions of impotence and all the stuff about sex is because in both South America and in Europe, it's very much the province of women who make it. So if you look through all the trials of witchcraft, you will often see women who are making chocolate being accused of putting all sorts of spells and potions into the chocolate, and therefore making their husbands impotent and everything else like that. And this is where some of the sort of slightly sort of peculiar stuff about why chocolate and sex get associated, and then end up being associated by Cadbury's with Valentine's boxes, all come from.
Well, there we go.
Question, how come the bohos taste so much like berries? It's the latua. It's basically the beans and the fermentation. So cocoa is just like wine in the sense that you have different grapes and you have different fermentations. And it's that which drives the flavor, which is then coaxed out by the maker. And it literally, there's nothing added to it. But the reason why it has those red berry notes is because that is the characteristic of those beans and that fermentation.
I have to say that's kind of that was my ta-da moment when we first started working together, Spencer, because I appreciated that different beans would give you different flavors, and why shouldn't it, just like a wine? But it's the recognizing, and to Sam's point about how come it tastes so much like berries, once you hear it and once you know, that's, I have this incredible tart currant flavor lingering in my mouth, which is just amazing. And hopefully, Sam, you will see throughout the rest of the event as well, quite how different they all are. Which is, I suppose, the joy of tasting fine craft chocolate.
And fine wines.
There we go.
And the other trick, though, is again, just to sort of say, I mean, you are wonderfully articulate in delivering flavors, and lots of people in wine are, you know, tart, all those other words. We find that with chocolate, people often don't have that vocab. So again, just a quick shout out. If you want to use this sort of crib sheet, if you find that there's something on the tip of your tongue and you can't quite articulate it, just basically look for the words here, and then if you're with somebody else, see if you can use that with them.
Yeah, and that's a really good point as well. I mean, the way that we learn in the world of wine is by those crib sheets. You know, you just have to have the words ready in your Rolodex to be able to use them. It's not so much that people are sort of super tasters, just have better memories.
Yeah.
So on to the next pairing. So I'm going to talk about the Pedroncelli. And Pedroncelli is a lovely wine from Sonoma coast, which, as you would expect, sorry, I should actually say it's from Sonoma County, which is in the wine regions of Northwest America. Surprise, surprise. And it's actually sort of, oh gosh, I've gone too far. Sorry, pardon me. Very sensitive little mouse today. So essentially, Sonoma benefits from what they call the Petaluma Gap. So hopefully you can just see here. And again, there is a reason I've picked a cool climate wine. So Sonoma County at large, the more southerly parts, I should say, have this influence. And effectively what happens is you get the Pacific Ocean cold waters, much like the South African wine we just had, but it gets sucked through the Petaluma Gap and pulled through Sonoma County. And it's why the finest wines in the world are made, to be honest with you. But it was some of the finest wines in the world, obviously. But it does mean that the Cabernets from Sonoma in particular are a little bit cooler than you might find elsewhere in in California. This particular winery, which is Pedroncelli, was founded in the 20s, so it survived some pretty tough times through prohibition and all sorts, and I think is amazing value. It's run now, so it was opened by Giovanni and Giulia Pedroncelli, so of Italian origin, and now run by their son Jim and his children, and I think it's incredible value for this part of the world. Realistically, Sonoma County is one of the most famous places, and it's worth saying that Gainesville, or Gearsville, depending on your accent, which is where some ridge vineyards are, is just to the east of where this particular wine is from, which is Dry Creek Valley. So in terms of real estate and property, it's in an incredibly good spot. It's also got gravel soils. So really here we're talking about really great soils for Cabernet, the best sort of real estate neighbours you can ask for, and this cooling influence from the Petaluma Gap, which again, I think is going to help out when we start to compare it to the second half of our wines. It's definitely got more of this freshness, this lift that Spencer was mentioning earlier. Again, this has seen a little more oak. And so they hand harvest for quality. They then ferment in steel to retain that berry flavour. And then they put about a third of this wine into French oak to soften the tannins. Much like the last wine, but almost to a greater extent. Cabernet can sometimes take on a slightly vanilla character. Not always, and I think there's a little bit here. And Sarah's mentioned it in her tasting note. But it's got that kind of slight cocoa, slight vanilla. For me, you can't find better value Californian wines. I mean, a Californian wine to get to us for under £15 is completely insane. And Spencer will be pleased to hear there's a touch of Cabernet Franc in this. So it's 85% Cabernet Sauvignon, 6% Cabernet Franc, and then I think it's sort of equal or very equal parts Merlot, Petit Verdot, and Malbec. So it's a very traditional Bordeaux blend. It's actually using the grape varieties that Bordeaux used to use and doesn't even really use themselves now. I'm talking in particular of Malbec, which is not warm enough or doesn't get the regular warmth to produce Malbec, but used to in Bordeaux. So it's a sort of Bordeaux fake, but it's not styled. It's very similar, I guess, to the first wine. It's not styled to be like a Bordeaux, but it does have a kind of freshness plus berry thing that the first one did. I would just say here, where we had maybe a slightly more leafy character in the Syrah, this is definitely a fruitier wine. And I think I was trying to match a bit more of, how would I describe it? Almost a wine that I wanted to have like a Black Forest Gatto, if you see. So like anything that's got a bit of, how would I describe it? A chocolate torte with with some berries on it. That's really what I was going for here. So I'm going to hand over to Spencer and he'll be able to tell you hopefully about our next bar, the Tanzanian. I was about to say Tasmanian.
It is Tanzania. And just a quick warning to some of you. It is possible that some of you may have the 70% rather than the 80%. And the reason for this is literally an avalanche in Norway, which stopped us getting in some of the bars. So rather than basically not being able to send you out, we have unfortunately had to send some of you 70% Tanzania bar, but don't worry if you've got it. It is still very, very similar. We actually use it just to show you how the addition of sugar is really all about bringing out the flavor. It isn't about adding sweetness. So whether you've got the 70 or the 80%, don't worry too much. A couple of other quick comments. As you're probably undoing this bar, you will be petrified by the fact that it's making all this rattling noise, and Anna will probably just be able to demonstrate that just as I had. Do not worry. This is because it's an incredibly environmentally friendly packaging format, which we'll come on to in a minute, because this is something which craft chocolate is all terribly important for it, and basically the way that it focuses. But this bar is sort of quite extraordinary in terms of how it's quite extraordinary in terms of actually how it's made on an international scale. So we've got Simran, who is actually a Brit who's been educated in America, going out to Tanzania with a partner who is Indian, and also another partner who is from Ireland. And then it is being made in Norway in a place called Fjak by a lady from the Basque region, and then a South Korean. So this is truly a very, very international bar. And again, what I just want you to focus on is the oddness of this bar, because it comes from Tanzania, which is not somewhere which is where, chocolate is not native to Tanzania. But if you try it, one of the things I'd first like you just to focus on and just compare it to the other chocolates is, in wine, and Anna's going to be able to do this much better than me, but you talk about sort of primary, secondary, and tertiary, in terms of like what drives flavor. We actually have something sort of similar to that in chocolate. And I think what's actually sort of happening here is this is an example from chocolate. So just as, in chocolate, it's a question of the beans and then the fermentation. And by the way, those wooden boxes are what most great craft chocolate is fermented in. And just as with wine, depending on the yeast you get, depending on the fermentation approach you get, you will get radically different flavors. The same is true of chocolate. And if you come to one of our other tastings, we'll basically show you this with different fermentations. But the other thing which makes a huge difference is actually how the maker works their chocolate. And you can see there are two chocolate makers, And behind them are these sort of round drums. And just to sort of give you a quick sort of other big thank you from the world of craft chocolate, those drums are what we call grinders and conchas or mélanges. They're actually how we grind the cocoa beans down into the cocoa paste. And believe it or not, they are actually based on Indian lentil grinders. But before we go any further, basically just sort of, let me just quickly talk to you a little bit about how chocolate spreads around the world. So I need the next slide to explain this. So chocolate spreads around the world really because of one problem, and it's diseases. But there are two different diseases which basically explain why chocolate moves. Because the first place that we actually know that chocolate is grown and is sort of turned into something that we drink is actually not Mexico. It's actually Ecuador and Peru. That's where cocoa, Theobroma cacao, grows. But the first place it's really cultivated in a big way is Mexico. But by the time the Europeans get into chocolate, the problem is plague, bubonic plague, has basically, and smallpox in particular, has just completely decimated the populations of Guatemala, the last bar you had, and Mexico. So basically chocolate starts to get grown down in Venezuela and in Ecuador. But then, because of the way it's grown in these sort of mass cultivation places, it gets terrible diseases like frosty pod, witch's broom, and lots of other stuff. And that's the reason why it starts to spread around the world. It doesn't actually hit Africa until another disease is controlled, which is malaria. So the reason why Africa isn't colonized for a long time is actually because we couldn't get in there until we basically figured out how to deal with malaria. But basically, if you want to understand the spread of chocolate and why chocolate moves, you know, from Mexico down to South America and then to Africa, the key vector, the key thing to understand is disease. So there you go. That's another pub quiz answer that you probably won't expect to get tonight. But I think more importantly, let's just sort of hope that you like that. And just one other quick one, just in case you're worried about Valentine's Day. I know that we've now passed it, but just quickly, Valentine's Day and chocolate, it's sort of a bit of a myth. But and if you want to know the origins to Valentine's Day, it's really strange. As far as we can tell, it actually dates back to a Roman festival called Lupercalia, which is still celebrated in some parts of Eastern Europe, where basically people would cover themselves, or men at least, would cover themselves in sort of sheep and goat skins, and then run around trying to whip their partners, who would then throw water all over them. And this, the church is not very fond of. So it basically comes up with the idea of basically getting rid of Lupercalia and having Valentine's Day. There are lots of different saints who are called Valentine's Day. One in particular basically sort of tries to basically enable Roman soldiers to marry, but it's all very complicated. It then sort of disappears until Chaucer gets back into it in the 14th century with when he's sort of talking about the fowls and everything else like that. And then Cadbury's, it's probably the only truly great bit of original marketing, because most of the other stuff is actually done by Fry's. But they do come up with the idea of basically gifting boxes like the one you can see there, which is basically what they call a fancy box, which is the idea. Victorians were very much into sort of sending one of the cards. And so Cadbury's thought, well, why not just send chocolates as well as the cards? And that's where the idea of Valentine's boxes comes from. There you go.
Wonderful. My birthday is Valentine's Day, so I must say I don't mind receiving chocolates on my birthday. It's absolutely fine. I received some lovely chocolates. Yes, I received some lovely chocolates this year. I don't mind at all. They're usually not a Valentine's present. They're usually a birthday present from my mother, but I'm okay with that. Right. So we've got our third pairing. I think for me, this was a pairing of two halves. I really wanted to use those first two chocolates. Just talking about that pairing before we go on to pairing number 3. I've just retasted it again. It is that really lovely kind of dried fruits, but it's not sweet dried fruits. You know, it's not this kind of stewed baked fruit that's coming through on my Swedish / Tanzania chocolate. It's very much a like a picante. It's got a lot more freshness and tartness to it. So I think that's why I liked it so much. It is that dark chocolate, almost, with the dried, what's the word I mean? Sort of candied fruits on the top.
Yeah, it has got a little bit of, it has got almost like a Christmassy sort of note to it.
Yeah.
But
it does feel like that there's a bit of a gear change, because we're going to change the style of chocolate significantly. I mean, I've really changed the style of wine. So,
yeah, you definitely have. So we're going to basically say goodbye to Ager from Basque Country and Svi from Korea, who are in Norway, bringing chocolate in, grown by Irish people, Brits, in Tanzania. So I think we bring you international delight.
And we're going to go back to South Africa for our next wine, but an unbelievably different style. I'm only just pouring mine now. It's nice and chilled, but like I said, members, if you didn't manage to chill it, please don't worry. It actually drinks beautifully, chilled and not chilled. But I wanted to show you the color. First of all, it's just so beautiful and extraordinary. And it looks like a rosé, but I promise you now it's going to taste nothing like one. So it wasn't my intention to use two South African wines. And actually, I chose this wine first. But as I mentioned, with the first pairing, I really struggled to find the right Syrah that was cool enough but fruity enough. So I ended up going for two South Africans, and I hope you'll excuse me because this is, for me, just one of the most lovely pairings. One of the reasons I say that is that Catherine, my colleague, and I basically use this wine whenever we possibly can. So it's from bear with me. So this is essentially what looks like a modern winery and isn't. So it's a really great slice of history, this winery. So it's spelt new, pronounced nay, and it was a co-op established in 1963, which in the world of South African wine production is not too old, but it was produced pre-apartheid and had survived very well with 23 members. And they would have been told which wines they could and couldn't make. And before 1990s, it was very popular to make fortified wines in South Africa. They have stuck with the Afrikaans name, which is Muscadel. And that is the name. It's actually the name, it's a bit confusing. It's the name for the grape variety Muscat of Frontignan, but you will find it used for any Muscat species of grape variety. This one actually does happen to be the traditional Frontignan. So they're definitely keeping it traditional with this. Essentially, and I don't mean to sound bad, this is like fortified grape juice. So it's sort of a take on, well, it's not a take on because the South Africans were doing this as long as the French have been, really. It's a bit like a Muscat de Baume de Venise, if anybody's had one. Mm-hmm. So you bring the Muscat grapes in, Muscat de Frontignan, they won't, though I think it's sort of 2 days maximum that they crush them, and you get a little bit of color from the skins. And then what you do is quick ferment way before it's had any time to produce any proper alcohol, when you've still got 250 grams ish of residual sugar left in your juice. You pour a whole load of grape spirit in, and obviously traditionally, way back when, hundreds of years ago, it was popular because it made the wine stable. So for all the ships that were passing through the Cape, it was a really good wine for whacking in your ship. And the interesting thing is now it's sort of not trendy, but it's a style of wine. I think Joe's put it here. You can use it as a mixer. Now, personally, I would prefer not to, but you can understand why you would use it as a mixer. It's really refreshing. It's almost like a light version of a Muscat de Baume de Venise in my head. It's definitely not this kind of heavy, gluggy fortified wine. And they do make other wines here at Nuit, but this is sort of less than 12%, about 10% of their production now. But it is probably their most famous. It's definitely the most internationally famous. And I think it's a shame that it's not a trendy style of wine, because actually it hits me in all the right ways. So strawberry, yes. I think it's also got some sort of rose petal and floral character. It's really unique. Kind of raspberries, red currants, lots and lots of red fruit, but I really like that floral hint. And if anybody's had a Muscat de Baume de Venise recently, I shouldn't say I don't like them. There's only a couple of Muscat de Baume de Venices I've ever tried that I've thought, oh my God, that's just pleasure. I often find they can be really cloying and they haven't got the right acidity. And even though this is in Worcester, this winery, it still retains this amazing freshness. I suspect they're picking the grapes quite early in order to keep that freshness. But that's one of the reasons why it does lend itself to being slightly chilled. You give the illusion of freshness slightly more. But for me, it was a bit of a no-brainer to have this wine in the mix. And I wanted to choose something that was on that sort of sweeter, more more immediately friendly and pleasurable style. This is sunshine in a bottle, and this chocolate that Spencer's about to talk about for me is sunshine in a packet. So it was a bit of a no-brainer to put these two things together. So I hope that everybody enjoys it, and I hope that if you've never tried this style of wine before, it's not the most common in South Africa now, but it is a little slice of history, and I think we should revive it. I think it's absolutely delightful. What do you think, Spencer? Something a bit different?
I think it's amazing, and I'm intrigued by it. I mean, I think it begs a question, though, which is, other than with chocolate, when and how do you have it? It's one of those amazing wines, but it's sort of like begging for an occasion. I mean, it's just delightful. I mean, I think it's, you know, I think it's full of fruit. It's got great character. It's lovely and long, but you know, it's not a food wine necessarily. It's something that you sort of like, you have to figure the occasion to it. It's the sort of wine that I would love to have on a hot summer's evening with some chocolate.
Yeah.
Because it's very, very Moorish.
I'll tell you what else it does go with, and maybe there's a merge that I want to make happen now that I've never thought about, but it goes really well with just fresh strawberries.
Yeah. It's a pudding,
particularly kind of straight out the garden, really, really ripe ones. So maybe I need to be dipping my strawberries in chocolate for the ultimate happiness.
I think strawberries, chocolate, and this wine is just, you know, summer's delight. I cannot imagine going anymore. Before everybody gets too excited about the chocolate, though, I'm going to give you some good news. This chocolate has got less added sugar than any of the other chocolates we're going to have tonight, even though it's a milk chocolate.
Really?
And the reason for this is that the milk is used as the sweetener. We actually do some chocolates which have got no added sugar, they just have milk. But you pick one here deliberately, a 65% dark milk from the man we know as the Great Dane, Mikkel Frisholm, who actually is an extraordinary chocolate maker based in Denmark. And he is actually one of the very, very few people in the world of chocolate who can actually claim to do something which in the wine industry you think of as being just sort of like, you know, sine qua non. It's just an obvious statement. It's exactly what you're always talking about. What's one of the first things that people talk about whenever they have a bottle of wine? They talk about the grape variety. And the interesting thing with this chocolate is this is one of the very, very few when we can actually tell you about the beans. And the reason for this is something slightly odd, which is that, by the way, that is Mikkel, the sort of, and by the way, Mikkel is huge. He's like about 6'6". He is basically your archetypal Viking. He's absolutely lovely. He is absolutely fantastic. We get him over to the UK. He stays in our house once or twice a year. He's just a legend. He's won more chocolate awards than just about anybody else. But he's basically pioneered one extraordinary aspect of chocolate. So if you think about grapes or you think about apples or oranges, the interesting thing about them is that you can very easily tell what sort of grapes they are, what sort of apples they are, you know, whether they're, I'm not going to do wine because that's Anna's business, but if you think about, you know, apples, you can sort of easily sort of tell, is it a Cox, is it a Granny Smith and everything. People have worked out how to do that. And the reason why you can do it is the fruit of a tree is basically going to get its genetics, if you like, from the tree, no matter how it's pollinated. The interesting thing about chocolate is that you aren't actually eating the fruit. The fruit is the pulp, which you can also buy from us. We sell cocoa pulp. But you're eating the seeds. And just as if you plant two seeds from two different apple trees, you will get very different apples coming out of it. The same is true of chocolate. So one of the interesting things about cocoa is it's very rare for us to be able, sorry.
You're right, Spencer. Do you need me to move on? Sorry.
I just need us to come back in just quickly.
Oh.
Can you still see me?
I can see you. I hope everyone's enjoying that chocolate as much as I am.
So just very quickly, the thing that I just wanted to just quickly sort of talk about is the fact that you can get these different chocolate varieties, because he has basically worked out a way so that you can identify them and work with them. And now that we're talking about the cocoa varieties, what I'd really like to sort of now focus on is this one other aspect, which is all the nonsense which is talked about, the stuff that's in chocolate, which is supposedly an aphrodisiac, which is the next chart. And it basically boils down into 4 different things. So one of them is called theobromine. The next one is called phenylphenylphenamine, which is PEA, which is basically what people confuse with oxytocin. And then there's tryptophan, which is the same stuff that turkey's got in it, which makes you happy. And then it's quercetin, which is sort of like a sort of modern day Viagra. Now, it's undoubted that chocolate contains all of these things. The bad news I've got for all of you, but we're going to give you the good news in a sec about chocolate and Valentine's Day, is that what is basically happening here is that with all of these, you've got a bit of nonsense, which is that these products do not pass what we call the blood-brain barrier. And this basically means that we really, really, really have the great delight of being able to work with this chocolate and delight in it without getting worried about anything else happening with it. So there you go. But basically, anybody tells you that chocolate's got aphrodisiac qualities in it, I'm really sorry, they just don't understand the chemistry. Yes, there are chemicals in it which people associate with lots of different things, but they don't pass the blood-brain barrier. This is the reason why people get very confused by whether chocolate keeps you awake at night. Theobromine, which is the main stimulant inside chocolate, is not like caffeine. Caffeine does pass the blood-brain barrier. That's the reason why the adenosine receptors get switched off and everything else like that. But theobromine, which is the main stimulant in chocolate, does not pass that. However, if you're worried about chocolate keeping you awake, you are slightly right if you're very sensitive to caffeine, because there are trace elements of caffeine in chocolate. So there you go.
Well, that's fine. It will just sort of perk me up for the rest of my evening.
Yeah, it'll just keep you going for the next sort of hour or so, but then it'll quickly go off it.
Well, exactly. And that's why it can be so lovely. I mean, I grew up in a household, I think I told you before, Spencer, my dad was a big dark chocolate, in particular nut, and we would always just have a little bit at the end of a meal, or if we went to sit on the sofa, and it was sort of the little pick-me-up after a sluggish meal or a big dinner. And you know, a lot of people always say to me, and we've talked about this, the second stomach and all of that, but
yeah, we have.
There's a reason that people enjoy that little pick-me-up at the end of a meal, but you're quite right, it's not that it keeps me awake at night. I think it's more psychosomatic than anything else.
Yeah, I think that is probably what it is.
Well, after that, we are going to move. I'm sort of sad but happy, because we get to go back to the Pump Street, which is a delicious chocolate. So I am excited.
I'm very sad to be leaving this wine too.
I know. But I think for me, the reason that this pairing worked, sorry, I should do more of that. I get too excited. But the reason for me that this pairing worked is it had this, I found some sort of peachy notes in this. But it had that kind of, and the creamy texture, I think, as well. We're talking about a wine with no tannins now, which was very different. We had chats about astringency earlier. There's no astringency to be found in this wine. Or if there is, again, you're very sensitive to astringency, which some people are. You know, some people that don't drink any red wine might find a little bit of tannin in this, but the reality is there's not much. And likewise, the chocolate has that creaminess. So I think for me, it was... going back to that cuddle in a glass, they're both very friendly, both very approachable, but it's really the red fruit that was the clincher. That kind of red grapey thing went very well with the sort of peachy character that I found in the chocolate. So I enjoyed that.
It's got sort of those yellow apricot peachy fruits to it, but it's also, because Nicaraguan beans, most cocoa beans are about 50-52% cocoa butter. This is actually 55% naturally, and then Mikel actually adds a bit of cocoa butter in that European style, and that gives it that sort of, you know, it's the Mikel hug, as we call it.
It is. I'm glad you called it that. That should have been a bit weird to say that, having not met him.
He's well, when you're in Europe, you'll have to go and see him. But he's the guy who basically supplies all the chocolate to Sonoma and all that sort of stuff. He is a legend. He's an amazing man. I mean, absolutely amazing chocolate maker, and his partner Cindy makes the most amazing tea cakes for anybody. And if any of you are actually going to go to Copenhagen, do write to us afterwards, and we will make sure that you go and sort of meet the Great Dane. Oh,
fabulous! I'm going to have to put it on my bucket list. This is also the one that I want to hide for my husband, who's in the kitchen, because he will snaffle that one up.
That's the reason why we only gave you a small bar, to get you to buy more of it. But no, it's just basically to sort of hit the right price point.
Well, exactly. It's a real treat, that one. But actually, I love the Pump Street, so I'm really excited to go back to that. And we've got quite an unusual wine to finish on as well. So this is a reef soap, but it is an ombre. Oh, Sam has just asked, before we move on, you did mention the wrapping was sustainable. Are you all right to quickly talk about that for a second, Spencer? And then I'll go on. I'm
absolutely fine to be doing that. So just quickly,
For anyone who missed it, Spencer obviously mentioned that I was doing a lot of rustling, opening the last chocolates.
It's the reason why it has this sort of lovely sort of crackle is because it's actually made out of cellulose. So it's wonderful for the environment. I'm really sorry to say it is not great for when you go to the cinema. It will definitely disturb everybody if you have this in the cinema, not least because you will probably want to come back for a second, third, fourth, I hesitate to say even a fifth piece. And so basically you've got to be sort of quite careful, sort of put lots of clothes on top of it or something else like that as you try and get it out. But yeah, it is all environmentally incredibly friendly. I mean, we'll come on to this in a minute when we talk a little bit about the environment and chocolate, but one of the great things about chocolate is that people don't realize is that if you want to save the planet, one of the great things you can do is to basically switch from having mass-produced chocolate to craft chocolate. Mass-produced chocolate is one of the most terrible products for greenhouse gases. It's basically up there with beef, up there with lamb. It's just absolutely disastrous. It basically, if an avocado on toast is like 150 liters of water to grow it, chocolate is 1,500 to 2,000. We've done this before in other tastings. It's just horrific. And there's so much. Well, I'll come on to this. So we'll do it in a minute. So I'm going to come on to this in just a sec.
We'll do it with a nice glass of something. So yes, we've got a Riveso, slightly darker color than our last wine, but this is again a fortified wine. But the interesting thing about this wine is hopefully if you have got the two side by side, you will notice that this one is much browner. Actually having them now side by side, significantly so. One is sort of almost rose petal salmon color and the other one is brown. That is on purpose. Your wine has intentionally been rancioed. So again, we're talking about a really traditional style of wine here. It's from a famous estate that was founded in the 20s again, and it was made at a time when fortified wines were ruled the roost down in the Roussillon, which is this little mint green colour right at the bottom of your map. And this producer used to make a lot of styles of fortified wine. They now focus solely, and I have some issues with showing this picture because I don't think it looks as glamorous as the other ones. But this is the reality of how a lot of these Roussillon vineyards are farmed. These are really old vines. Look at them; they're like witches' fingers, and it's very dry. They can't grow any cover crops. It's very warm. But what that does is it lends itself to this particular grape variety, Macabeu. And Macabeu is popular in basically the southern parts of France and then northern Spain. And what they do to produce this wine, the reason I did get this picture up, and this is from the producer, I think this probably does a good job of explaining how the style came to be. What they do is they take their Macabeu and they produce a wine and then they fortify it, just as our last one was. This one is to 18%. So it is technically a Vendu Natural. So it is actually almost made in a similar style to the last wine, but they do something significantly different. In fact, here they do a couple of things. They take glass demijohns and barrels and they don't top them up. So in that heat, they evaporate a little and that leaves a gap, which allows some oxygen to come in. That oxygen, well, first of all, the evaporation just concentrates everything. So the sugars, that's left, the acidity, absolutely everything is concentrated. And then a little bit like sherry, that gap where the oxygen has been let in actually intentionally oxidizes the wine as well. So you get this nutty character. And I will be very honest, and I'll hold my hands up. At my MW week, my year 2 MW week a couple of weeks ago, we had a Riveso Ombre, and the Riveso Ombre I put down as a Madeira, and nobody in my vicinity of the sort of 8 people that were tasting with me, nobody put it down as a Riveso. Everyone said either Madeira or sherry, and we were really confused about this wine. And if you're sort of equally as confused, it's because it's kind of had everything done to it. Even it's been aged in a Syrah system, so it's had different years blended together, which is why there's no year on the label here, because it's lots of different years all in one blend. So anything you can imagine to possibly happen to this wine, it's happened. The reason I really like it is it's got these kind of slightly nutty characters. It's got the Macabeu almost provides a really weird undertone of something quite tropical and juicy, but it's layered with this strange nutty thing. And because it was fortified, it's got about 120 grams per litre of sugar. So it has got a little bit of sugar. And I think that whereas the last wine was very sweet and very friendly, this for me is the wine at the end of the night that you take to the sofa and you think about. It's a real kind of pondering wine, and you get something new every time you smell it. So it's very unusual and a very, very special wine. They're very rare now, and rare enough for a group of MW stage 2 students to not even remember it existed. And then I really kicked myself because I thought, I'm showing one of these in 2 weeks, and I tasted it, you know, a couple of months ago when I was preparing for this event. But they are often wines that go really well with chocolate. I've just realized I haven't got the actual page up. And I think Marcel, who buys this wine, even suggests to pair it with chocolate. Yes, chocolate-based desserts. And I'll let you all into a secret. If you ask Marcel which wines go with chocolate, he very, very rarely gives you an answer. And so to say, for him to put his, you know, mark his name to the flag on this and say, this is a wine to go with chocolate, means a lot coming from Marcel Orford-Williams. So I felt like I was making a good choice. And it's what the locals will drink with it, blue cheese or chocolate. So there we go. What do you think, Spencer?
I think it's amazing. I mean, and I'm intrigued by, I would have gone with you. I would have said this is a Madeira, not a sherry. Doesn't quite have those floral characteristics, but what an amazing wine. I mean, just delicious. But I also think you've answered my classic question, which is, you know, that I love, you know, both the Muscatel that you've given us and this Rousseau. And the question I always have is, well, when can I have them? And you just answered it. It is basically what you sit back with a book or in the front of the telly with a bit of chocolate, and you just savor and you love it and you delight it. But what an amazing history. And just, you know, it's gorgeous. I mean, it's got all this complexity, and it really, really, you know, just expands and just takes you on an amazing journey.
The nice thing about Muscadel as well is it does have slightly more natural acidity than Muscadel or Muscadet or than the grape used in the previous wine, which often I think for the warm climate, the Muscat-based Vin Doux Naturals can sometimes get a bit flabby, but there's nothing flabby about this, especially again if you've served it slightly chilled. It's got this really great freshness. It's sort of in my nose fresh, which I think is lovely.
Before I dive in and talk about why the chocolate pairing works so brilliantly, I've got a quick question for you, which came from the audience, which is, how long will this wine, and in fact all the other wines, stay, you know?
Good question. VDNs, so the last two are VDN, Vin Doux Natural style. You want to be slightly careful because you can't do a one-size-fits-all. But what I would say is the first wine, so our Muscadel, was not aged oxidatively. So there was an active decision by the winemaker to preserve the freshness. It will keep because of the high alcohol, but it won't necessarily kind of last for a really, really long time. So for that, I'd keep it in my fridge for a couple of weeks for the penultimate wine. For this final wine, it's already been through the ringer. Everything that you could do to that, it's already had done to it. So you really can keep those for quite a while. And that's why I think wines like that are so popular at Christmas time, because you can sort of open one on the 20th of December and drink it right through to the middle of January and just have a little bit. You don't need much of that wine. It's so powerful. And just drink a little bit of that over the course of, you know, a few evenings. As for the other two, they're just sort of standard red wines. So I'd be trying to drink those within 3 days. Anything you put in the fridge will keep it a little bit longer. So if you've refrigerated your red, you can go to maybe 4 days or so. But yes, so thank you, Kevin.
Do not put your chocolate in the fridge. It's a terrible...
Yeah, so you can put your wines in the fridge. Don't put your chocolate in.
Don't put your chocolate in the fridge. It's terrible because you will basically do what is called retempering. And there's only one upside to retempering, which I'll come on to in a minute. So if you've ever had chocolate on a hot day and it's melted a bit, do not put it in the fridge, because what's going to happen is when it comes out of the fridge, you will have done technically what's called retempering. Tempering is the sort of technical term used to describe changing crystal structure. So you talk about tempering steel. And the magic of chocolate is that snap, which we talked about before from this chocolate, which basically means that at crystal structure 5, we haven't got anything more sexy in the world of chocolate than crystal structure 5. But crystal structure 5 basically means that it's going to melt when you put it in your mouth. Now, if you put it in the fridge after it's got hot, it is likely to hit crystal structure 6. Again, we're not very good in terminology in chocolate. But what that basically means is that when you put it in your mouth, it will basically not melt. And so you won't get any flavor out of it. But don't give up all hope, because there are a couple of things you can do with it. If it's good chocolate, you can still use it for cooking. You can still use it for making hot chocolate. And of course, the white stuff, which has risen to the top, is cocoa butter. And cocoa butter is a natural unguent. It's the cosmetics delight. It's what you put in lipstick, shaving lotions, etc., etc. So if on Valentine's Day you've got any of this stuff hanging around, you can rub it on yourself, or if you're feeling very your partner. But if you've got a bar of dairy milk, please, please, please do not replicate, because a dairy milk is full of things like, vegetable fat and palm oils, and that's like rubbing margarine on your loved one, which is not going to be popular. But anyway, let's get back to the chocolate. The other thing about the chocolate, actually, which is great on this, is that it's basically created by Chris and Joanna Brennan. But if you look at the packaging here, it is deliberately designed to do all the key things that basically, Corrigans and everybody else do for chocolate, which is it keeps it in a dark place. You can take the oxygen out of it, and you can basically put it under your bed, which is basically pretty stable and normal for most people in terms of temperature. But if you try this chocolate, and by the way, when you join Cocoa Runners, we do a monthly subscription service by which you can get 4 bars of chocolate, etc. The first thing we actually send to you is one of these, which is based on Chris and Joanna's lovely packaging, so that you can basically store any chocolate, like all the chocolate you've had tonight. And in fact, the next time we do a wine society tasting, I should have put this in it, shouldn't I? This was terrible. I didn't do this at all well. But anyway, look, this is basically Chris and Joanna down in Orford. Chris is an amazing bloke, born in Jamaica, IBM engineer, 15 patents of software to his name, video game maker, came back to the UK when he met his wife, who's English, got into bread. Joanna smartly persuaded him to start making chocolate. He's one of the first guys in the UK to be directly importing beans, has some from Jamaica, but this one is actually from some mates of his from Grenada. And it's a beautiful, creamy, raisiny. It's the raisins, I think, which sort of do this. This to me is sort of rum and raisin chocolate. Yeah. And it just goes brilliantly well with the chocolate. And it's just fantastic. And actually, I'm going to use the next couple of slides just to go back to that point I was making about environmentalism. So look, if there's nothing about chocolate in terms of like the quercetin and all the other tryptophans and all the other phenolphthaleins and everything else, even if they don't make you feel romantic, the great thing about chocolate is it is a romantic gift. It shows you're thinking about somebody. It shows you're savoring. But what I'd also like you to try and do is, if you remember the Flake advert when the lady was in the bath, I would just like to go back to one comment about chocolate and water, which is on the next slide, which is a slightly strange one. You may not believe it, but this bar of chocolate requires 1.5 to 2,000 litres of water to grow. That is a staggering amount of water, much more than a bottle of wine. And there's a double whammy with this, with chocolate. It's fine to have this sort of chocolate, which is basically all about preserving the rainforest. But if you go on to the next slide, what you're going to see is the real challenge with chocolate is whether it comes from South America. That, by the way, sort of like slightly strange country, which you probably can't recognize down in the bottom left, is Ecuador. The one to the top right, the one to the bottom right, rather, is Côte d'Ivoire. And what you can see is the fact that they've all been not just decimated, but basically, Ecuador never used to have any problems with drought, never used to have any problems with irrigation. It's now got permanent drought. Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, which is where 70% of the world's chocolate came from, used to be 60 to 70% rainforest. By 1990, it's below 30%, and now it's 1 or 2%. And this is an absolute disaster, not just because of deforestation, but also because of desertification. So the next slide actually sort of shows you that point I was trying to make earlier, which is that if you look at the next slide, what you'll see on it is that, can I just have the next slide and then we'll sort of get to it.
There we go.
This is a slightly strange chart. It basically shows you, it's a little bit difficult to read, but it is important because what it shows you is the greenhouse gas emissions of different foods. So basically, if you eat, McDonald's, sorry, if anyone works at McDonald's, very unfair of me to say this, but basically rubbish meat is just terrible for the environment. Even if you eat great beef, it's not that great. Lamb, bit better. Farm prawns, bit better. The extraordinary thing about chocolate is that chocolate is, after beef, about the worst thing you can eat if it's mass produced. But if you have great craft chocolate like this stuff, which is all about preserving the rainforest, it's one of the very, very few crops which really forces people to think about preserving the rainforest. So it's incredibly good for it. So let's get back to the pairing. So let's just talk a little bit about that. But to me, the lovely thing about this chocolate is the raisin notes. sort of the creaminess of it too, because of the way that there's a couple of things that Chris does here. So one of which is he has a very, very thick mold. So if you compare it to some of the other chocolates that we have, for example, the Fjak, this is about twice the depth. So in wine, you often basically talk about how different wine glasses will change the way in which you perceive the aromas and the way in which you get the flavor. With chocolate, that's actually to do with the mold, because that's what drives the first thing which releases flavor in the mouth, which is how long it takes to dissolve, how long it takes to melt. And this chocolate is designed to be very rich, very luscious, and it really brings out some of that sort of richness that you've got in this lovely root cell.
Yeah, I think it's that decadence. And maybe that's why, because I questioned whether the order was right a couple of times. And gosh, I had a horrible time having to go back and forward. And actually,
I must be terrible tasting all these wines and chocolates.
Oh,
by the way,
it's awful. Such a hard job.
Everybody knows. The genius of this tasting is all Anna. Anna, basically what happens in these tastings is I send Anna a bunch of chocolates, which I think would be, different and fun to try. And then Anna has the hard work of basically getting through about 30 or 40 different chocolates with about 300 different wines. I don't know, it's not quite that many, but you get the idea. And then comes up with these just genius pairings. Right?
I mean, they're quite different. What I would say about this last one as well is, more than the others, for me, the chocolate has brought out more fruit in the wine. So this is the one for me where the wine really changed with the chocolate.
Yeah.
Beforehand, it was kind of nutty and more savory, and it had more of what you would describe as that rancio character. But I mentioned at the beginning that Macabau is actually quite a tropical wine and actually quite a fruity grape variety when it's not had all of this other work done to it. So for me, this is the funnest pairing personally, because you start with one wine, you taste the chocolate, and then you have another wine in your glass after you've tasted the chocolate. So that's kind of the joy of pairings. It doesn't have to always be like that. You don't always have to make these huge changes, but I find this one the most fun for that reason. What did you think?
So for me, this is definitely the most insightful. But I think if I was going to, I think it is probably what I would sort of call the sofa wine. Like if I have like 6 or 7 hours ahead of me, I'm not sure I'm going to make it through, because I'm just going to basically do this. I think you've done though with the first 2 red wines and chocolates too. And I also think you've done great with the Muscatel. I'm not sure that, I don't know how actually I'd be able to sort of say which is the best pairing, but I think it is, the trick is 1 + 1 = 5. And what you're trying to do is learn more about the wines and learn more about the chocolates by just seeing how they combine to create a little bit more.
Exactly. And I think that's worth mentioning. There's, for anybody who was sort of expecting other styles of wine, there are other styles of wine that go with chocolate, but I think just by the nature of some of the flavor components that we've already talked about, lots of the berries, nuts, etc., there are certain styles of wine that lend themselves more. And I get a bit upset, and I know we sell one at the Wine Society, so I shouldn't be too mean, but I don't love the idea of pairing sort of light sparkling wines with truffly chocolates. It just doesn't do anything for me. They're a nice combination because of the occasion, but flavor wise they don't challenge me in any way, and they don't kind of explore.
Big jar of it.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, whilst I would probably be rather unwell if I did an evening like this every evening of these 4 sort of rich blockbuster wines and the 4 chocolates, yes, it's not something you do every night, but I hope that you enjoyed yourself, members. It was my pleasure, honestly, putting it together, as we mentioned, and it's been an absolute pleasure again to see you, Spencer, so thank you.
Thank you so much. I love doing these are just like, we love doing the chocolate only ones too, and I really hope as many of you as possible can, and I'll get Anna to send you an invitation to them all. But this is just so special. I mean, I love the Wine Society, I love your wines, I love everything you do, and I just love the fact that you can show me aspects of chocolate that I thought I knew until I basically pair them with your suggestions. It's just brilliant.
Oh. Well, thank you. So on that note as well, thank you to members for joining. I will send you Spencer's website details. Obviously, if you bought the chocolates, you already will. Somebody said get the monthly subscription from, so the Andersons, sorry, have said get the monthly subscription from Spencer.
I'll send everybody a code for that, and I'll send everybody 50% discount for that and for any of our own virtual tastings. But I'd also encourage you all to basically make sure that Anna does another tasting with us, please. please.
I will. Don't worry. Catherine's nipping at my heels because she's desperate to do one. So Catherine will be up next. She was going to join us this evening, and actually she's got the chocolates. So I'm sure she'll be sort of waiting, ready to pounce, because she loves these events as well. So thank you, Spencer. You're an absolute superstar. I really appreciate it. And I always learn something new from you.
Well, we always learn from you too. I've got to fill up my glass. I've managed to sort of been downing too much of this.
Thank you all, and good evening. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.